Daniel Mercer knew something was off the moment he entered his house. It wasn't anything obvious, just a peculiar stillness combined with subtle details that didn't align with how he'd left things that morning. The living room lights were dimmed despite the late afternoon hour. A half-empty bottle of wine sat on the coffee table alongside two glasses, one bearing a distinct smudge of his wife's favorite lipstick. Music played softly from their bedroom upstairs, the playlist Rebecca reserved for special occasions. He hadn't planned to be home until late. The pharmaceutical conference he'd been attending in Chicago had ended a day early when the keynote speaker fell ill. Rather than spending another night at the hotel, Daniel had caught an earlier flight, thinking he might surprise Rebecca with dinner reservations at the Italian place she'd been wanting to try. Now, standing in his foyer with his carry-on bag still in hand, instinct told him to move quietly. Daniel set his bag down silently and slipped off his shoes. As he moved through the living room, he noticed Rebecca's purse on the sofa, alongside a man's leather jacket he didn't recognize. His heart began to pound as he registered what these clues were suggesting, but some part of him still clung to the possibility of an innocent explanation. Perhaps Rebecca had invited a colleague over to discuss work. Maybe the wine was left from a gathering he'd forgotten about. The jacket could belong to her brother, though it didn't look like Michael's style. But the music from upstairs, their bedroom, was harder to rationalize away. Daniel moved toward the staircase with measured steps, careful to avoid the third stair that always creaked under weight. The music grew louder as he ascended, a slow melody with sultry vocals that Rebecca had once described as perfect for reconnecting during their weekend getaways. At the top of the stairs, he paused, suddenly unsure if he wanted confirmation of what every sign was pointing toward. Did he really want to see whatever waited behind that partially closed bedroom door? Wouldn't it be easier to turn around, leave silently, and confront Rebecca later without the visual evidence seared into his memory? But Daniel had never been one to avoid difficult truths. In his 12 years as a pharmaceutical research director, he'd built his reputation on facing facts directly, however uncomfortable. That same instinct propelled him forward now, one careful step after another. As he approached the bedroom door, soft laughter drifted into the hallway, Rebecca's distinctive giggle, the one that started low and bubbled upward when she was genuinely amused. The sound pierced Daniel like a physical pain. He knew that laugh intimately from 8 years of marriage, from countless private jokes and shared moments. He pushed the door open slowly, silently. The scene that greeted him was both exactly what he had feared and somehow worse in its specific details. Rebecca lay on their bed, propped against the pillows, wearing nothing but his favorite blue button-down shirt, the one she often claimed from his side of the closet because she loved how it smelled like him. Her hair was tousled, her makeup slightly smudged, and she was smiling down at the man beside her with an expression of unguarded affection. The man, younger than Daniel by at least 5 years, with the lean build of someone who spent considerable time at the gym, was shirtless, his back to the door as he traced patterns on Rebecca's bare thigh with his fingertips. "I've missed this," Rebecca was saying, her voice carrying that particular warmth Daniel had once believed was reserved exclusively for him. "When can you get away next week?" "Tuesday, maybe Wednesday," the man replied. "Charlotte has that conference in Boston, so timing's perfect." Charlotte. The name registered immediately. Charlotte Ellis was a colleague of Rebecca's at the architectural firm where she worked as a project manager. Daniel had met her at company functions, had heard Rebecca mention her frequently in stories about office politics and client challenges. And now, apparently, she was the unwitting cover story for whatever had been happening in his absence. A cold clarity settled over Daniel as he watched them for what couldn't have been more than 30 seconds but felt like hours. Neither Rebecca nor her companion had noticed him yet, too absorbed in each other to register his presence in the doorway. With deliberate calm, Daniel reached for his phone in his pocket, opened the camera app, and began recording. He captured 15 seconds of unmistakable footage, Rebecca in his shirt, caressing the man's face, laughing intimately at something he whispered, then leaning in for a lingering kiss. Only after securing this evidence did Daniel clear his throat. The reaction was immediate and chaotic. Rebecca's head snapped up, her expression transitioning from sensual contentment to shock in an instant. She scrambled backwards on the bed, clutching the shirt closed at her chest. "Daniel, what, you're supposed to be in Chicago?" Her voice pitched higher than normal, panic evident in every syllable. The man turned quickly, revealing a face that Daniel vaguely recognized, someone Rebecca had introduced at a company holiday party months ago. He grabbed for the sheet to cover himself, his expression cycling rapidly through shock, embarrassment, and calculation. "This isn't." Rebecca started, then faltered, the absurdity of denying what Daniel had clearly witnessed apparently occurring to her mid-sentence. Daniel stopped recording and slipped the phone back into his pocket. He hadn't planned what he might say in this scenario, had never seriously imagined he would need such a script. Yet now, facing the irrefutable collapse of his marriage, he found himself strangely composed. "Don't stop on my account," he said, his voice steady despite the thundering of his heart. "I just came to get some things." Conference ended early. Rebecca scrambled off the bed, still clutching his shirt closed with one hand. "Daniel, wait. Let me explain." "I think it's fairly self-explanatory," Daniel replied, turning to walk back toward the stairs. He had no interest in whatever narrative she might construct to rationalize what he'd witnessed. The evidence was unambiguous, requiring no further elaboration. "This isn't what it looks like," she called after him, the desperation in her voice suggesting she recognized the inadequacy of this cliché even as she voiced it. Daniel paused at the top of the staircase, turning back to look at her directly. "It looks like you're having an affair in our bed, wearing my shirt. Is that incorrect?" Her mouth opened, closed, then opened again. "It's complicated. Actually, it seems remarkably straightforward," Daniel countered, continuing down the stairs without waiting for a response. Behind him, he could hear scrambling movements, urgent whispers between Rebecca and her lover, the sounds of hasty dressing. By the time he reached the living room, Rebecca was rushing down the stairs, still wearing only his shirt, her bare legs carrying her across the room to intercept him before he could reach the front door. "Daniel, please. Don't leave like this. Let's talk about it." She positioned herself between him and the door, arms outstretched as if to physically prevent his departure. "I have nothing to discuss right now," he replied, stepping around her to retrieve his carry-on bag. "I need some space to think." "Where are you going?" Rebecca demanded, her initial panic giving way to something closer to indignation, as if his calm departure were somehow unreasonable compared to what she'd been caught doing. "Does it matter?" Daniel asked, genuinely curious about what right she felt she had to this information given the circumstances. "Of course it matters," she exclaimed. "You're my husband. We need to talk about this." Daniel studied her face, the face he'd woken up beside for 8 years, the face he'd trusted implicitly until 15 minutes ago. He searched for signs of the woman he'd believed her to be and found only a stranger wearing familiar features, her expression cycling between calculation and distress as she tried to manage a situation spinning rapidly beyond her control. "I'll call you tomorrow," he said finally, reaching for the door handle. It wasn't a commitment to conversation so much as a means of exiting without further confrontation. In this moment, he needed distance more than explanations. "You can't just leave," Rebecca insisted, her voice taking on the edge it acquired when she felt she was losing control of a situation. "That's not how marriage works. We need to communicate about this." The absurdity of her demanding proper marital communication after what he'd just witnessed nearly broke Daniel's composed demeanor. He allowed himself a small, incredulous laugh. "Perhaps that advice would have been more useful before I found you in bed with someone else." Rebecca flinched as if he'd raised his hand to her. "It was a mistake," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "A terrible mistake." From upstairs came the sound of movement, her lover presumably getting dressed, gathering his things, preparing for an awkward exit. The reality of having this conversation while a third party listened from above struck Daniel as both surreal and intolerable. "We'll talk tomorrow," he repeated more firmly, opening the door. "Right now, I need to not be here." He walked out without looking back, ignoring Rebecca's continued protests. The spring evening air felt shockingly normal against his face as he placed his bag in the trunk of his car and slid into the driver's seat. How strange that the world continued unchanged while his personal reality had just been comprehensively appended. Daniel drove without conscious destination, eventually finding himself in the parking lot of the Hampton Inn near his office. The impersonal hotel room seemed appropriate, neutral territory where he could process what had happened without the weight of shared history pressing in from all sides. Once checked in, he sat on the edge of the bed and finally allowed himself to feel the full impact of what he'd witnessed. The image of Rebecca in his shirt, the specific intimacy of that detail somehow cutting deeper than the infidelity itself, replayed in his mind with merciless clarity. The shirt she claimed because she loved how it smelled like him, now worn as a costume in his unwitting absence. His phone had been buzzing consistently since he left the house. Now he glanced at the screen, 17 missed calls and a stream of text messages, all from Rebecca. "Please come home so we can talk. This isn't what you think. It was a terrible mistake. Please Daniel, I love you. At least tell me where you are. We can fix this." Each message felt like a script she was following, responses generated from some handbook on how to manage the aftermath of being caught rather than genuine communications addressed to him specifically. The "I love you" struck him as particularly hollow, given what he'd witnessed just hours earlier. Daniel set the phone aside without responding. What was there to say? The evidence wasn't ambiguous or subject to interpretation. There was no misunderstanding to clarify. Rebecca had made choices, not just today but apparently for some time, given the casual reference to previous meetings and future plans. After a long shower that did little to wash away the mental images haunting him, Daniel finally replied with a single text. "We'll talk tomorrow. I need space tonight." Rebecca's response was immediate. "Please come home. I'm worried about you." The concern rang false, prompting another small, incredulous laugh from Daniel. She hadn't been worried about him when planning assignations during his business trips or discussing future meetings while another man touched her intimately. He didn't respond further, setting his phone to do not disturb mode before attempting to sleep. Rest proved elusive, his mind cycling through memories of their marriage, searching for signs he might have missed, indicators that should have alerted him to Rebecca's duplicity. There had been changes in recent months, increased working late, more weekend client emergencies, a subtle shift in her attentiveness. But Daniel had attributed these to a particularly demanding project her firm was handling, had even compensated by taking on more household responsibilities to support her through what he'd assumed was a stressful professional period. The realization that he'd been facilitating her affair through his accommodation added another layer of betrayal to the already painful situation. He'd been preparing dinner for her late arrivals, handling grocery shopping and laundry to free her weekends, all while she was investing that time and energy elsewhere. Morning arrived after fitful sleep, bringing no clarity but at least some emotional distance from the immediate shock. Daniel showered and dressed in yesterday's clothes, then checked his phone to find another stream of messages from Rebecca, growing increasingly demanding overnight. "Why aren't you answering? This is childish. Running away doesn't solve anything. I made one mistake and you're acting like everything is over. I deserve a chance to explain." The characterization of what he'd witnessed as one mistake particularly struck Daniel. The conversation he'd overheard made it clear this was an ongoing arrangement, carefully planned around schedules and alibis. The attempted minimization felt like another layer of disrespect piled atop the original betrayal. After ordering breakfast from the hotel's room service menu, Daniel finally called her, deciding that extending the silence would only escalate the situation further. Rebecca answered on the first ring. "Daniel? Where are you? When are you coming home?" "I'm safe," he replied, deliberately not specifying his location. "I needed some time to think." "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice carrying an edge of frustration. "You can't just disappear because we had a problem." "A problem," Daniel repeated, noting the continued minimization. "Is that how you'd characterize what I walked in on yesterday?" "It was a mistake," Rebecca insisted. "A terrible lapse in judgment that meant nothing. Mark is just a colleague who you were planning to meet again on Tuesday or Wednesday," Daniel interrupted, when Charlotte would be conveniently away at a conference. The line went silent for a moment. "You were eavesdropping?" "I was standing in the doorway of our bedroom," Daniel corrected. "Hardly eavesdropping when you're having the conversation in my house, on my bed." "Our house," Rebecca countered reflexively. "Our bed. And that's exactly why we need to talk about this in person, not over the phone like strangers." Daniel closed his eyes, suddenly tired beyond measure. "Fine. I'll come by this afternoon. We can talk then." "Thank you," Rebecca said, audible relief in her voice. "I'll make lunch. We can sit down like adults and work through this." The carefully managed tone, the immediate pivot to controlling the circumstances of their conversation, all of it felt performative rather than genuine, designed to create a scenario she could navigate toward her preferred outcome. Daniel recognized the approach from previous conflicts, though none had ever approached this magnitude. "I'll be there around 1, he said, ending the call without waiting for her response. The hours before their meeting stretched interminably. Daniel used the time to organize his thoughts, determined to approach the conversation with clear boundaries and specific questions rather than allowing emotional reactivity to drive the interaction. At precisely 1 o'clock, he pulled into the driveway of the home they'd shared for 6 years. The house looked exactly as it had yesterday, its familiar exterior offering no indication of how fundamentally the reality inside had changed. Rebecca opened the door before he could use his key, her appearance carefully curated for the conversation ahead, minimal makeup suggesting authentic emotion, casual but flattering clothes projecting approachable sincerity. Daniel recognized the strategic presentation from her professional toolkit, the same careful image management she employed for difficult client meetings. "Thank you for coming," she said, stepping back to allow him entry into what had been his own home just 24 hours earlier. "I made sandwiches. I thought we could talk in the kitchen." Daniel followed her through the living room, noting that all evidence of yesterday's encounter had been meticulously removed: no wine glasses, no unfamiliar jacket, no visible indications that anything out of the ordinary had occurred. The kitchen table was set for lunch, complete with place settings, a small vase of flowers, and the promised sandwiches. The carefully arranged scene struck Daniel as another performance element, a staged backdrop for the conversation Rebecca had undoubtedly been rehearsing since his departure. "Before we start," Daniel said as they took their seats, "I'd like to establish some parameters for this discussion." Rebecca looked momentarily surprised but nodded her agreement. "Of course. I'm interested in honesty, not carefully constructed narratives," Daniel continued. "What I witnessed yesterday was unambiguous. I'm not here to debate whether it happened or what it meant. I'm here to understand how long it's been going on and where we go from here." Rebecca's expression shifted subtly, her rehearsed approach requiring adjustment. "I understand you're hurt and angry. You have every right to be. What you saw was a terrible mistake, one I deeply regret." "How long?" Daniel asked simply. Rebecca hesitated, clearly recalibrating. It wasn't what you think. Mark and I work closely together on the Henderson project. Things have been stressful, and we've been putting in long hours. Yesterday was the first time anything physical happened." Daniel studied her face, noting the slight tells that had always signaled her dishonesty, the micro-expression of calculation, the subtle tension around her eyes. After 8 years of marriage, he knew her patterns intimately. "That doesn't align with what I heard," he said calmly. "You specifically discussed previous meetings and were planning your next encounter around Charlotte's schedule." Rebecca's composure faltered momentarily before she recalibrated. "You misunderstood. We were talking about work meetings for the Henderson project. Charlotte is our team lead who—" "Rebecca," Daniel interrupted gently. "I'm not interested in a revised script. I heard what I heard. I saw what I saw. You were wearing my shirt while making plans to see him again. This wasn't a first-time mistake." Her expression hardened slightly. "Fine. We've been seeing each other for about 3 months, but it's not serious. It was just physical, a stupid, reckless decision that doesn't reflect how I feel about our marriage." 3 months, Daniel repeated, the timeline aligning with the changes he'd noticed in her behavior. "While I was taking on extra housework to support what I thought was your demanding project schedule." Rebecca had the grace to look momentarily ashamed before recovering. "I never meant to hurt you. It just happened." "Things like this don't just happen," Daniel countered. "They require planning, deception, and consistent choices to maintain. You created alibis. You coordinated schedules. You brought him into our home, into our bed." "I made a terrible mistake," Rebecca insisted, tears forming in her eyes. "But one mistake shouldn't erase 8 years of marriage. We can work through this, get counseling, rebuild trust. Couples survive affairs all the time." Daniel considered her carefully. "Is that what you want? To try to rebuild?" "Of course," she said immediately, reaching across the table for his hand. "I love you, Daniel. What happened with Mark was meaningless, just a stupid mistake that got out of hand. You're my husband. You're who I want to be with." The ready answer, the practiced sincerity, the strategic tears, all of it felt like a performance designed to manage a crisis rather than an authentic expression of remorse or affection. Daniel gently withdrew his hand from her grasp. "I need to think about what happens next," he said. "I'm not making any permanent decisions today, but I also can't stay here right now. I'll find a short-term rental while we figure things out." "That's not necessary," Rebecca insisted. "This is your home too. If anyone should leave, it's me." The offer surprised Daniel slightly. It wasn't the response he'd anticipated. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely. I'll stay with Lisa for a few days while we work through this. It's the least I can do." She paused, then added with careful vulnerability, "I'll do whatever it takes to fix this, Daniel. Just tell me what you need." Lisa was Rebecca's closest friend, a divorcee who lived nearby. The arrangement seemed reasonable, offering them both space to process without either having to secure immediate new housing. "That would be helpful," Daniel acknowledged. "I think some separation is necessary right now." Rebecca nodded, visibly relieved that he hadn't immediately declared the marriage over. "I understand. I'll pack some things after we finish talking." The conversation continued for another hour, cycling through Rebecca's explanations, apologies, and assurances that the affair meant nothing, that Daniel was who she truly wanted. Throughout, he maintained his composure, neither accepting nor rejecting her narrative, simply absorbing information while she attempted to navigate toward reconciliation. When they finally concluded, Rebecca went upstairs to pack while Daniel remained in the kitchen, mentally processing everything she'd shared. Her characterization of the affair as meaningless contradicted what he'd witnessed: the intimate laughter, the unguarded affection, the casual planning of future encounters. The disconnect between her words and her observed behavior reinforced his sense that she was managing a crisis rather than expressing genuine remorse. After Rebecca left for Lisa's with a suitcase and promises to check in tomorrow, Daniel finally allowed himself to truly exhale in the empty house. The silence felt both comforting and oppressive, a physical manifestation of the space he'd requested to make decisions about their future. His phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "Just arrived at Lisa's. Thank you for talking today. I know we have a lot of work ahead of us, but I'm committed to rebuilding what we had. I love you." Daniel didn't respond immediately, uncertain what he could honestly say. The declaration of love felt particularly hollow in light of yesterday's discovery. Instead, he set the phone aside and walked through the house, taking inventory of the space they'd shared and the life they'd built, now revealed to be at least partially constructed on deception. In the bedroom, he found Rebecca had stripped the sheets and remade the bed with fresh linens, another strategic detail designed to literally clean away evidence of her transgression. The gesture struck him as both considerate and manipulative, practical and performative. As evening settled over the house, Daniel's phone buzzed again, another message from Rebecca. "I know you need space, and I'm trying to respect that. But please know I'm here whenever you're ready to talk more about moving forward together. What we have is worth fighting for." The confident presumption that they would be moving forward together gave him pause. Throughout their conversation, he'd been careful not to commit to reconciliation, stating only that he needed time to consider options. Yet Rebecca's message suggested she'd interpreted his measured response as tacit agreement to work on the marriage. This subtle reframing of their interaction reflected a pattern Daniel was beginning to recognize more clearly: Rebecca's consistent reshaping of reality to align with her preferred narrative, regardless of actual events or statements. Before he could consider how or whether to respond, his phone rang, not Rebecca this time, but his brother Michael. "Hey," Daniel answered, realizing he hadn't spoken to anyone besides Rebecca since discovering the affair. "What's going on?" Michael asked without preamble. "I just got a strange call from Rebecca saying you two are working through some issues and asking if I would be there for you during this difficult time. She made it sound like you had some kind of breakdown." Daniel closed his eyes, momentarily speechless at this unexpected development. "I walked in on her having an affair yesterday," he said finally, "in our bedroom, with a colleague named Mark. She was wearing my shirt." "Jesus," Michael breathed. "That's not at all what she implied. She made it sound like you were having some kind of crisis and had temporarily moved out while getting help." The calculated narrative management didn't surprise Daniel, though the speed with which Rebecca had begun implementing it was notable. "She's staying at Lisa's for a few days while I figure out what I want to do next," he clarified. "There was no breakdown on my part unless you count the reasonable distress of finding your wife in bed with someone else." Wow. "I'm sorry, Daniel. What do you need? Want me to come over?" The offer was tempting. Michael lived about an hour away, and his steady presence would be welcome. But Daniel recognized he needed time to process before engaging with even well-intentioned support. "Not tonight," he replied. "But maybe tomorrow? I could use the company, and apparently I need to clarify what's actually happening before Rebecca's version becomes the official family narrative." "I'll be there by noon," Michael promised. "And don't worry, I'll set the record straight if anyone else calls with Rebecca's creative interpretation of events." After ending the call, Daniel sat with the new information, recognizing that Rebecca's narrative management had already extended beyond their private conversation and into his broader social network. The revelation of her affair was being reframed as his emotional crisis, a subtle but significant shift that positioned her as the supportive spouse managing a difficult situation rather than the partner who had betrayed trust. The calculated nature of this approach, initiated within hours of their conversation, solidified something in Daniel's perception of the situation. Whatever genuine remorse Rebecca might feel seemed secondary to her determination to control the narrative and navigate toward her preferred outcome, regardless of the actual circumstances or his clearly stated need for space to make decisions. With this clarity came a corresponding resolve: he would not allow her to reshape reality unchallenged, either between them or within their broader social circle. The truth of what had occurred, supported by what he had personally witnessed and recorded, would remain the foundation of whatever decisions followed, however difficult those truths might be. Michael arrived at 11:30 the next morning, earlier than promised and carrying 2 cups of coffee from Daniel's favorite local shop. "Figured you could use this," he said, handing over one of the cups before pulling Daniel into a brief, firm hug. "How are you holding up?" "About as well as could be expected," Daniel replied, leading his brother into the kitchen. "Still processing, I guess." Michael took a seat at the counter, studying Daniel with the particular scrutiny that came from a lifetime of knowing someone. "Rebecca's been busy," he said after a moment. "She called Mom last night." Daniel set his coffee down carefully. "And what version of events did Mom receive?" "That you've been working too hard, had some kind of stress-related episode, and are taking time to recalibrate while she gives you space," Michael reported, his tone making clear what he thought of this narrative. "She managed to make it sound like she's the supportive wife making sacrifices for her troubled husband. Did Mom believe her?" "Initially, maybe. But I called her right after we spoke last night and clarified the actual situation. She's..." Michael paused. "Well, she's Mom. Upset, angry on your behalf, wanting to call Rebecca directly and have a conversation that would probably involve vocabulary she normally reserves for political discussions." Despite everything, Daniel smiled slightly at the accurate characterization of their mother's protective instincts. "I hope you talked her down from that particular intervention." "For now," Michael confirmed. "But I'd call her sooner rather than later if you want to maintain that ceasefire." As if summoned by the discussion, Daniel's phone buzzed with his mother's distinctive ringtone. He showed the screen to Michael with a resigned expression before answering. "Hi, Mom." "Daniel James Mercer," his mother began without preamble, her voice carrying the particular mix of concern and indignation that had signaled serious discussions throughout his childhood. "I just got off the phone with Michael, who tells me that Rebecca has been unfaithful and is now attempting to paint you as having some kind of breakdown. Is this accurate?" Daniel sighed, catching Michael's apologetic shrug from across the counter. "That's the simplified version, yes. I came home early from Chicago and found her in a compromising situation with a colleague. And now she's calling family members with some fabricated story about you having stress issues?" His mother's voice rose slightly. "The audacity of that woman is truly remarkable. Mom, I appreciate your concern, but I'm still figuring out how to handle this. I don't need you calling Rebecca or getting involved beyond listening if I need to talk." "I have no intention of calling Rebecca," his mother replied with dignity. "That would accomplish nothing productive. But I will not stand by while she attempts to rewrite reality to protect her reputation at your expense. Your father and I are here for whatever you need, and we'll make sure the extended family understands the actual situation if Rebecca continues her creative storytelling." After reassuring his mother that he was handling things as well as could be expected and promising to call more regularly during this period, Daniel ended the call and looked at Michael with a mixture of exasperation and gratitude. "Sorry about that," Michael offered. "But better to have Mom activated as an ally than left in the dark where Rebecca's narrative might take root." "You're right," Daniel acknowledged. "I just wasn't prepared to manage family dynamics on top of everything else right now." "That's what I'm here for," Michael said, opening his laptop. "Information control and brother support services, all in one convenient package. Now, tell me exactly what happened. I want to understand the full situation." Daniel recounted the events of the past 2 days, beginning with his early return from Chicago and ending with Rebecca's strategic communications to family members. As he spoke, the emotional weight of the situation seemed to distribute slightly, the burden marginally lighter for being shared with someone who unequivocally had his interests at heart. "So what's your next move?" Michael asked when Daniel finished his account. "I don't know," Daniel admitted. "Part of me wants to believe reconciliation is possible, that this was an aberration rather than a fundamental revelation about who Rebecca is. We've built 8 years together. That's not nothing." "True," Michael acknowledged. "But those 8 years included the version of Rebecca who could look you in the eye while carrying on an affair, then immediately launch a campaign to control the narrative when caught. That's not nothing either." Before Daniel could respond, his phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "Checking in to see how you're doing. I miss you. Would it be okay if I stopped by to get a few more things this afternoon? Maybe around 3? Michael read the message over Daniel's shoulder. "That's interesting timing. Right when she knows I'll be here, assuming you told her about my visit." "I didn't," Daniel replied, realizing the implication. "She doesn't know you're coming over." "Interesting," Michael mused. "So either she's doing standard check-ins, which is reasonable, or she's got another agenda for the visit. Daniel considered the possibilities. It might be completely innocent. She did leave with just one suitcase. Could be, Michael agreed. Or it could be phase 2 of narrative management, the in-person assessment of your emotional state and another opportunity to reinforce her preferred storyline. Daniel reread the message, weighing his response options. After a moment, he replied, "That's fine. Michael is here, just so you know." Rebecca's response came quickly. "Oh. I didn't realize you had company. I can come another time if that's better?" The subtle shift from specifically requesting to come at 3 p.m. to offering to reschedule once Michael's presence was revealed seemed to confirm his brother's suspicion about agenda. "Called it," Michael said after reading the exchange. "She wanted to catch you alone." Daniel sighed, recognizing the pattern but still reluctant to attribute purely calculated motives to every action. "Let's not go full conspiracy theory. She might genuinely want to give us space for brother time." "Possibly," Michael conceded. "But her track record for transparent motivations isn't great at the moment." Daniel considered a moment before responding to Rebecca. "No need to reschedule. 3 works fine." A brief delay preceded her answer. "If you're sure. See you then." The conversation with Michael continued over lunch, shifting from Rebecca's situation to work, family updates, and other aspects of life, a deliberate broadening that Daniel appreciated. For a few hours, he existed as more than just a man dealing with infidelity. He was a brother, a professional, a person with interests and opinions beyond his current crisis. At precisely 3 o'clock, the doorbell rang, a notably formal choice given that Rebecca still had her key. Daniel opened the door to find her looking casually elegant in jeans and a sweater, her hair and makeup carefully styled to project approachable sincerity. "Hi," she said, offering a tentative smile. "Thanks for letting me come by." "Of course," Daniel replied, stepping back to allow her entry. "Michael's in the kitchen." Rebecca's smile flickered almost imperceptibly at the reminder of his brother's presence. "Great, I'd love to say hello before I grab my things." In the kitchen, Michael's greeting was polite but distinctly cool, civil without the warmth that had characterized their previous interactions. The subtle shift in temperature wasn't lost on Rebecca, who adjusted her approach accordingly. "I won't take up much of your brother time," she assured them both. "I just need a few work outfits and some toiletries I forgot yesterday." "Take whatever time you need," Daniel said. "We're just catching up." Rebecca nodded, moving toward the stairs with a final glance at Michael that suggested she'd registered his changed demeanor and was recalculating accordingly. Once she was upstairs, Michael lowered his voice. "She's got good control, I'll give her that." Barely flinched when she realized I wasn't buying the stress breakdown narrative. "She's always been composed under pressure," Daniel acknowledged. "It served her well professionally. And apparently in extramarital crisis management," Michael added dryly. Rebecca's movements were audible overhead, closet doors opening, drawers sliding, the familiar patterns of someone navigating a space they know intimately. After about 15 minutes, she reappeared with a medium-sized duffel bag and a garment bag containing what appeared to be several work outfits. "Got everything?" Daniel asked, moving from the kitchen to the living room as she descended the stairs. "I think so," Rebecca confirmed, setting the bags near the door before turning to face him. "Can we talk briefly before I go?" "Just a few minutes." Daniel glanced toward the kitchen where Michael remained, deliberately giving them nominal privacy while staying within earshot. "Sure. I just wanted to check in on how you're doing," Rebecca began, her voice calibrated to convey concern without pushing boundaries. "I know you needed space, and I'm trying to respect that. But I also want you to know I'm here whenever you're ready to talk more about everything." "I appreciate that," Daniel replied, maintaining the neutral tone he'd established since discovering the affair. "I'm still processing. Having Michael here helps." Rebecca nodded, glancing briefly toward the kitchen before refocusing on Daniel. "That's good. Family support is important right now." She paused, then added with careful emphasis, "for both of us." The subtle positioning, placing them both as individuals navigating a shared difficult situation rather than acknowledging her role in creating it, was precisely the narrative management Michael had predicted. "Have you thought any more about counseling?" Rebecca continued when Daniel didn't immediately respond. "I found someone who specializes in helping couples rebuild after situations like ours." "Situations like affairs, you mean," Daniel clarified, unwilling to accept the euphemism. Rebecca's composure flickered momentarily before resettling. "Yes. After infidelity. Dr. Winters has excellent reviews and could see us as early as next week if you're open to it." The presumption that he would be ready for couples counseling within days, coupled with the revelation that she had already researched and contacted a therapist without discussing it with him first, reinforced Daniel's growing recognition of Rebecca's approach, managing the situation toward her preferred outcome while creating an appearance of respecting his boundaries. "I'm not ready to make decisions about counseling yet," Daniel replied. "I said I needed time to think, and I meant it. That includes decisions about whether reconciliation is what I want." Rebecca's expression shifted subtly, a momentary calculation visible before settling into one of patient understanding. "Of course. I didn't mean to push. I just wanted you to know the option is there when you're ready." She reached for her bags. "I should get going and let you get back to your brother time." As she moved toward the door, Rebecca turned back with a carefully vulnerable expression. "I miss you, Daniel. I know that probably doesn't mean much right now, but it's true. What happened with Mark was a mistake that I regret more than I can express. You're the one I want to be with, the one I've always wanted to be with." The declaration struck Daniel as both possibly sincere and strategically delivered, emotional leverage applied at a carefully selected moment with his brother as witness, creating maximum impact while minimizing the possibility of detailed questioning or challenge. "I'll call you in a few days," he responded, neither accepting nor rejecting her declaration but maintaining the boundary of time and space he'd established. After Rebecca departed, Michael emerged fully from the kitchen, his expression thoughtful. "She's good," he observed. The careful positioning, the strategic vulnerability, the couple's situation framing rather than her affair, all of it delivered with perfect pitch. "That doesn't necessarily mean it's insincere," Daniel pointed out, feeling a reflexive need to consider the possibility of genuine emotion beneath the calculated presentation. "No, it doesn't," Michael conceded. "But sincerity and strategy aren't mutually exclusive. She could genuinely regret the affair while still approaching its aftermath with calculated precision." The observation resonated with Daniel's own conflicted assessment. Throughout their marriage, Rebecca had demonstrated a remarkable ability to navigate complex social and professional situations, reading rooms, adjusting approaches, securing desired outcomes through carefully calibrated interactions. These same skills, once admired in professional contexts, now appeared more concerning when applied to their personal crisis. "What struck me most," Michael continued, "was the 'I've always wanted to be with you' claim, delivered right at the exit moment for maximum impact with minimum scrutiny. That's a specific technique, the emotional statement timed to preclude follow-up questions like, 'If I'm who you've always wanted, why were you making plans for ongoing meetings with Mark when I wasn't supposed to be home?'" Daniel sighed, recognizing the accuracy of his brother's analysis while still feeling a pull toward charitable interpretation. 8 years of marriage had created deep grooves of emotional connection and benefit of doubt extensions that weren't easily abandoned, even in the face of unequivocal betrayal. "I need to figure out what I want," he said finally. "Whether this is something we can work through or if it reveals fundamental incompatibilities I can't overlook." "Fair enough," Michael agreed. "Just make sure your decision is based on who she actually is, not who you thought she was or who she's strategically presenting herself to be right now." The advice followed Daniel into the evening and subsequent days as he navigated the strange new reality of his life, living alone in the house they'd shared, fielding carefully crafted messages from Rebecca that balanced respect for his stated need for space with subtle nudges toward reconciliation, updating family members who had received varying versions of events. 5 days after discovering the affair, Daniel received an unexpected text from an unfamiliar number. "Daniel, this is Charlotte Ellis, Rebecca's colleague. I think we should talk. It's important." The message gave him pause. Charlotte, the unwitting alibi mentioned in the conversation he'd overheard between Rebecca and Mark. The woman whose conference in Boston would have provided cover for their next planned encounter. After consideration, Daniel replied, "What would you like to discuss?" Her response came quickly. "Not over text. Can we meet?" "Somewhere public but private. It's about Rebecca and Mark." The request triggered both curiosity and caution. Why would Rebecca's colleague reach out directly? What information could she have that warranted an in-person conversation rather than a phone call or message? "I can meet tomorrow at Riverside Cafe, 10 a.m. Back corner table," Daniel suggested, selecting a location that would provide sufficient privacy for conversation while remaining in a public setting. "I'll be there," Charlotte confirmed. Daniel debated whether to inform Rebecca about the planned meeting, ultimately deciding against it. Whatever information Charlotte wanted to share, filtering it through Rebecca first would likely compromise its authenticity. The following morning, Daniel arrived at the cafe early, selecting a table in the back corner that offered a view of the entrance while providing some acoustic privacy from other patrons. At precisely 10 o'clock, a woman he recognized from Rebecca's company functions entered, scanning the room briefly before spotting him and approaching with purpose. Charlotte Ellis was professionally dressed in a tailored pantsuit, her auburn hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, her expression serious as she took the seat across from him. After brief introductions and declining his offer to order coffee, she got directly to the point. "I'm here because I discovered something disturbing," she began, her voice low but clear. "Rebecca has been using me as an alibi for her relationship with Mark. She told him I was going to Boston for a conference next week, which isn't true. There is no conference. She's been creating cover stories involving my schedule without my knowledge." Daniel nodded, unsurprised by this confirmation of what he'd already suspected. "I overheard them discussing those plans when I discovered them together." Charlotte's expression tightened. "That's not all. Yesterday, Rebecca approached me directly, asking if I would back her up if anyone at the firm questioned her relationship with Mark. She implied it was a recent, one-time mistake that was being blown out of proportion by her emotionally unstable husband." The characterization stung despite its alignment with the narrative management Daniel had already observed in other contexts. "I assume you're here because you didn't agree to participate in that plan." "Absolutely not," Charlotte confirmed, her professional demeanor momentarily giving way to evident disgust. "I've known Rebecca for 3 years. We've worked closely on multiple projects. I thought I knew her character. But this, using me as an unwitting accomplice, then asking me to actively participate in a cover-up while maligning her husband, crossed every professional and personal boundary I recognize." She reached into her bag and withdrew a folder. "I brought this because I thought you should have all the information. Mark and Rebecca have been involved for at least 4 months, not the 3 she apparently admitted to you. I know because I inadvertently saw messages between them in January when Rebecca asked me to check something on her phone during a client meeting." The folder contained printed emails and text message screenshots, evidence Charlotte had apparently been documenting since becoming aware of the relationship, perhaps as professional protection against being implicated if the situation became problematic at work. "I should have said something sooner," Charlotte acknowledged as Daniel reviewed the materials. "But it felt like interfering in someone else's marriage, which I've always considered inappropriate. When Rebecca directly asked me to participate in deceiving both you and our firm, that line was clearly crossed." Daniel studied the evidence, exchanges between Rebecca and Mark dating back to mid-January, far earlier than the 3 months Rebecca had reluctantly acknowledged during their kitchen table conversation. The messages included plans for meetings, discussions of how to manage their schedules to avoid detection, and occasional references to Daniel that ranged from dismissive to outright disparaging. "Why show me this now?" Daniel asked, looking up from the documents to study Charlotte's expression. "Why get involved at all?" "Because Rebecca is now actively trying to damage your reputation to protect herself," Charlotte replied without hesitation. "Claiming you're unstable, implying the affair was a one-time mistake rather than an ongoing relationship, using me and others as unwitting accessories. I have professional and personal integrity standards that won't accommodate being part of that." The meeting concluded shortly thereafter, with Charlotte refusing Daniel's thanks, "I'm not doing this for you specifically, but because it's the right thing to do," and departing with the same purposeful efficiency with which she'd arrived. Daniel remained at the table, reviewing the additional evidence and processing its implications. The documentation confirmed his growing recognition that Rebecca's narrative about the affair, its duration, nature, and her attitude toward their marriage, was significantly different from reality. The disparity between her carefully constructed explanations and the documented facts suggested a fundamental dishonesty that extended beyond the affair itself to her approach to accountability. That evening, as Daniel was preparing a simple dinner, his phone rang with Rebecca's number. He considered letting it go to voicemail before deciding direct communication was eventually necessary, however difficult. "Hello," he answered, his tone neutral. "Daniel," Rebecca began, her voice carrying a note of controlled urgency. "I just received a strange email from Charlotte. She's apparently given you some information about Mark and me. I wanted to discuss it with you directly before you form any conclusions." The immediate pivot to damage control confirmed Charlotte's account of events. Rebecca was actively working to manage the narrative as new information emerged, attempting to frame it before he could form independent assessments. "I met with Charlotte this morning," Daniel confirmed. "She provided documentation showing your relationship with Mark began in January, not March as you told me. She also mentioned you asked her to support your version of events at work and with me." A brief silence followed before Rebecca responded, her tone shifting to one of aggrieved explanation. Charlotte is blowing things out of proportion. Mark and I were just friends in January. The actual relationship didn't start until much later, which is what I told you. The messages she showed me were pretty explicit, Rebecca, Daniel countered, unwilling to accept the revised narrative. And they included plans for meetings, discussions of alibis, and some rather unflattering comments about me. Another pause, longer this time. I can't believe Charlotte would betray my confidence like this, Rebecca finally said, deflection replacing denial. Whatever she showed you was private communication taken completely out of context. The context seems fairly clear, Daniel replied. You and Mark have been involved since January, you've been actively managing alibis and schedules to facilitate the affair, and you've been disparaging me to him throughout. That aligns with what I personally witnessed and heard in our bedroom, but contradicts what you told me directly when we spoke. This isn't fair, Rebecca protested, her composed approach giving way to more evident frustration. You're taking the word of someone who barely knows our marriage over mine. Charlotte has no idea about our relationship or what I was going through when those messages were sent. The pivot to victimhood, positioning herself as unfairly judged while referencing unnamed difficulties that might explain or mitigate her actions, was another recognizable pattern in Rebecca's crisis management approach. I'm not taking anyone's word over yours, Daniel clarified. I'm looking at documented evidence that contradicts statements you made directly to me. That's not about Charlotte, it's about whether you've been truthful in our conversations about what happened. So that's it? Rebecca demanded, frustration evolving toward anger. You're just going to believe whatever narrative makes me look worst without even discussing it with me first? That's not how marriage works, Daniel. The implication of proper marital communication, coming from someone who had systematically deceived him for months while actively planning continued deception, struck Daniel as particularly hollow. I'm discussing it with you now, he pointed out calmly. And what I'm hearing is more deflection rather than acknowledgement that you've continued to misrepresent the situation even after being caught. Fine, Rebecca snapped, abandoning the composed approach entirely. Yes, Mark and I have been seeing each other since January. Yes, it was more than just physical. And yes, I said things about you I shouldn't have. Is that what you want to hear? Does that make your decision easier? The abrupt shift to aggressive honesty, deployed only after evidence made continued denial untenable, confirmed Daniel's emerging assessment of Rebecca's character. Truth wasn't her default, it was her last resort when strategic alternatives had been exhausted. What I want is to understand who you actually are, Daniel replied after a measured pause. Because the person I'm speaking with now doesn't seem much like the woman I thought I married. That's not fair, Rebecca repeated, her voice catching slightly. You're judging me based on the worst thing I've ever done while ignoring 8 years of marriage. I'm judging you based on a pattern of behavior that's becoming increasingly clear, Daniel corrected gently. Not just the affair, but the calculated deception surrounding it, the immediate narrative management after being caught, the continuing misrepresentations even during conversations ostensibly about rebuilding trust, and now the attempt to get ahead of evidence you knew would contradict your established storyline. The silence that followed was heavier than previous pauses, a recognition, perhaps, that the carefully constructed management approach had finally failed comprehensively. What happens now? Rebecca finally asked, her voice smaller than before. I think we both know, Daniel replied quietly. This isn't salvageable, Rebecca. Not after everything that's come to light. So you're just giving up? Without even trying counseling or— This isn't about giving up, Daniel interrupted. It's about recognizing reality. The trust is gone, and everything you've done since being discovered has only confirmed that the person I thought I knew doesn't exist. The conversation concluded shortly thereafter, with Rebecca cycling through additional attempts at narrative management, suggesting they meet in person where she could explain properly, proposing immediate counseling to work through these misunderstandings, and finally shifting to tearful appeals about their history together and potential for reconciliation. Throughout, Daniel maintained the calm clarity that had emerged from accumulating evidence and recognition. By the call's end, they had reached an implicit understanding, the marriage was over, with only the practical details of dissolution remaining to be addressed. After ending the call, Daniel sat in his quiet kitchen, experiencing not the devastation he might have expected but a strange sense of resolution. The Rebecca he had loved, the woman he believed he had married, had been partially a construction, a carefully managed presentation that aligned with his expectations and desires while concealing fundamental aspects of her authentic self. The discovery hurt, undeniably, but recognizing reality, however painful, provided a foundation for moving forward that continuing denial or strategic reconciliation could not have offered. His phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "I know you think your mind is made up, but please don't make permanent decisions while you're angry. We've built too much together to throw it away without at least trying to save it. I love you, Daniel. That's always been true, regardless of my mistakes." The message reflected Rebecca's continued attempt to frame this situation as a temporary emotional reaction rather than a rational assessment of fundamental incompatibility. The characterization of calculated, months-long deception as mistakes further confirmed the pattern of minimization that had been evident throughout their post-discovery interactions. Daniel didn't respond immediately, recognizing that additional communication would likely produce only more of the same strategic positioning rather than authentic accountability. Instead, he began mentally outlining practical next steps, contacting a lawyer, identifying important documents, considering how to approach the logistical details of separation. As he moved through the house gathering relevant paperwork, Daniel's phone buzzed repeatedly with additional messages from Rebecca, each attempting a slightly different approach to engage him in continued dialogue, appeals to their history, expressions of remorse, suggestions for professional intervention, and finally, thinly veiled indications that others wouldn't understand his decision to end the marriage so abruptly. The progression confirmed what Daniel had come to recognize. Rebecca's primary concern remained managing perceptions and securing her preferred outcome rather than genuinely addressing the harm she had caused or respecting his clearly communicated boundaries. Late that evening, as the stream of messages finally subsided, Daniel received one final text from Rebecca. "Since you won't respond, I assume you've made your decision. I've spoken with Lisa and will be staying with her for the foreseeable future. I'll have my lawyer contact you about next steps. For what it's worth, I truly am sorry for hurting you." The shift to formality, coupled with the immediate mention of legal representation, reflected yet another strategic pivot, from reconciliation attempts to position management for the separation process. The apology, while possibly genuine, was undermined by its placement as an afterthought following practical arrangements and legal notifications. Daniel placed his phone on the nightstand without responding, recognizing that they had entered a new phase where direct communication would likely be counterproductive. Whatever happened next would proceed through formal channels rather than personal appeals, a development that aligned with his emerging understanding of who Rebecca actually was beneath the carefully managed presentation he had accepted for 8 years. The woman he had found wearing his shirt in their bed, smiling at another man with unguarded affection, had revealed more truth in that unintentionally witnessed moment than in all her calculated explanations and strategic communications since. That recognition, while painful, provided the clarity needed to move forward without the confusion of managed narratives or strategic emotional appeals. 3 weeks after discovering Rebecca's affair, Daniel sat across from his attorney, Eleanor Winters, reviewing the preliminary divorce filing. A seasoned family law practitioner with 25 years of experience, Eleanor had been recommended by Michael's colleague who described her as strategically brilliant without being unnecessarily combative, exactly the balance Daniel sought in legal representation. "The initial financial disclosure seems straightforward," Eleanor observed, turning to the relevant section. "Your documentation is meticulous, which is refreshing. Most clients provide far less organized information. Organization is part of my professional skill set," Daniel explained. "And I've always managed our major financial matters, so I had access to most records already." Eleanor nodded approvingly. "Rebecca's attorney has requested a settlement conference before proceeding to formal court filings. That's generally a positive sign. It suggests they're not planning an aggressive litigation strategy. What should I expect from that meeting?" "Based on my communications with James Porter, he'll likely propose a fairly standard division of assets acquired during the marriage," Eleanor replied. "The house proceeds would be split equally, retirement accounts divided proportionally, and personal property allocated according to normal parameters." Daniel considered this information. "That seems reasonable." "It is," Eleanor agreed. "But reasonable settlement proposals often come with specific requests that matter significantly to the other party. My question is, what matters most to you in this process? What are your non-negotiables versus areas where you're willing to be flexible?" The question was one Daniel had been considering extensively since accepting the marriage was truly over. "I want a clean break without prolonged conflict. I have no interest in punitive measures, but I also won't accept any narrative that mischaracterizes what happened or my response to it." Eleanor made a note. "That's helpful." Regarding the narrative concern, Are you referring to the apparent attempts to portray you as having an emotional crisis rather than responding to discovered infidelity? Yes, Daniel confirmed. Rebecca initially tried to reframe the situation with family members and mutual friends. While that's mostly been corrected through direct conversations, I'm concerned about similar attempts during the formal separation process. Understood. Eleanor tapped her pen thoughtfully. Has there been any discussion between you directly about how to characterize the divorce to your social and professional circles? Not yet. We've had minimal contact since I made it clear reconciliation wasn't an option. Most communication has been through text messages about practical matters, when she'll collect additional belongings, mail redirection, utility transfers. Eleanor nodded. That's often the case once both parties recognize the relationship is truly ending. The conversation shifts from emotional appeals to practical considerations. She paused, studying Daniel carefully. There is one matter we should discuss before the settlement conference. Rebecca's attorney has informally inquired whether certain private documentation will be introduced during proceedings. Daniel immediately understood the reference. You mean the video I recorded when I discovered them together? Precisely, Eleanor confirmed. James was notably circumspect, but the implication was clear. They're concerned about potential use of that recording, particularly in contexts that might affect professional reputations. The recording had remained untouched on Daniel's phone since the day he captured it, 15 seconds of unambiguous evidence that had served its purpose by preventing Rebecca from denying or fundamentally mischaracterizing what he'd witnessed. He had never threatened to share it with others or even mentioned its existence in their limited post-discovery conversations. I have no intention of distributing that recording, Daniel said after a moment's consideration. I made it in the moment to ensure there could be no gaslighting about what I witnessed, not to create leverage or cause public embarrassment. Eleanor nodded, making another note. That position aligns with your stated goal of a clean, non-punitive separation. If you're comfortable, I can communicate that to James as a good faith gesture while maintaining that standard confidentiality expectations apply to all aspects of the proceedings. That seems reasonable, Daniel agreed. I've never wanted to humiliate Rebecca, just to ensure the truth wasn't distorted. The meeting concluded with additional discussion of practical matters, timeline expectations, document requirements, and communication protocols. Throughout, Daniel maintained the composed, methodical approach that had characterized his response to the situation since the initial discovery. While the emotional pain remained present, it no longer dominated his decision-making or perspective. As he left Eleanor's office, Daniel checked his phone to find a text from Rebecca. My lawyer says we have a settlement conference scheduled next week. Before that happens, I'd like to meet privately to discuss how we're handling this with friends and colleagues. Coffee tomorrow? The request seemed reasonable, a practical conversation about managing the social aspects of their separation. After brief consideration, Daniel replied, That works. Perkins Coffee on Main, 2 p.m.? Rebecca's response came quickly. Perfect. Thank you for being willing to talk directly. It means a lot. The following afternoon, Daniel arrived at the coffee shop a few minutes early, selecting a table in the corner that offered some privacy while remaining in the public space. At precisely 2 o'clock, Rebecca entered, her appearance carefully calibrated for the meeting, professionally attired but not overly formal, makeup subtle, expression composed but approachable. After ordering drinks, her typical complex specialty latte, his simple black coffee, they settled at the table with the awkward formality of intimate strangers, people who knew everything and nothing about each other simultaneously. Thank you for agreeing to meet, Rebecca began, her tone measured. I thought it would be helpful to align on how we're communicating about our situation to our shared circles. That makes sense, Daniel acknowledged. What did you have in mind? Rebecca took a careful sip of her latte before responding. I was thinking we could agree on a simple, neutral statement that doesn't assign blame or get into private details. Something like, after careful consideration, we've mutually decided to end our marriage. We appreciate respect for our privacy during this transition. The proposed language struck Daniel as notably different from Rebecca's initial attempts to characterize him as experiencing a stress-related breakdown. The shift toward neutrality suggested either sincere recognition that her earlier approach had been inappropriate or strategic adaptation based on its ineffectiveness. That seems reasonable for casual acquaintances and professional contacts, Daniel agreed. For closer friends and family, I'd prefer honesty without unnecessary detail, acknowledging that infidelity occurred rather than creating mystery that invites speculation. Rebecca's expression tightened slightly before resettling. Is that really necessary? Bringing that specific element into conversations just seems needlessly hurtful. I'm not suggesting announcing it broadly, Daniel clarified, but when close friends or family ask directly, I won't lie or obfuscate. I don't intend to volunteer details or characterizations beyond the basic fact. And what about at work? Rebecca pressed. My professional reputation is important. Having colleagues know those details could significantly impact my standing. The concern seemed both genuine and somewhat ironic given that her affair partner was himself a colleague, their relationship conducted partly within professional contexts. I have no intention of contacting your workplace or colleagues, Daniel assured her. But I won't actively mislead people who know us both if they ask directly. Rebecca studied him carefully, apparently assessing whether this represented his actual position or a negotiating stance. I appreciate that, she said finally. I know I have no right to ask for consideration after what happened, but it means a lot that you're not seeking to damage my professional standing. The conversation shifted to more practical matters, the upcoming settlement conference, the house sale process, and how to handle mutual friendships. Throughout, Rebecca maintained the composed, reasonable demeanor that had characterized their professional interactions throughout their marriage, with no hint of the defensive anger or strategic emotional appeals that had emerged immediately after the affair's discovery. As they prepared to leave, Rebecca paused, her expression shifting toward careful vulnerability. Daniel, I know reconciliation isn't what you want, and I'm trying to respect that. But I hope you know that despite my terrible choices, what we had for 8 years wasn't all a lie. I did love you, I still do, even though my actions made that impossible to believe. The declaration seemed potentially sincere, though its strategic placement at the conversation's end, preventing detailed response or examination, echoed the pattern Daniel had observed in previous interactions. Rather than engaging with the emotional aspect, he responded with simple acknowledgement. I appreciate you saying that. I think we're handling this process as respectfully as possible given the circumstances. Rebecca nodded, accepting the redirection without pressing further. I'll see you at the settlement conference next week, then. As Daniel watched her leave, he reflected on the strange disconnect between the woman he'd believed he was married to and the person who had been revealed through crisis, someone capable of sustained deception followed by sophisticated narrative management when discovered. The composed, reasonable Rebecca from today's coffee meeting aligned with his long-held perception of her character, yet that very alignment now raised questions about authenticity versus strategic presentation. The settlement conference proceeded largely as Eleanor had predicted. James Porter presented a conventional division proposal that aligned with standard practices for marriages of their duration and financial circumstances. The house would be sold, proceeds divided equally. Retirement accounts would be split proportionally based on contributions during the marriage. Personal property would be allocated according to normal parameters, with disputed items subject to mediation if necessary. Throughout the meeting, Rebecca maintained the same composed, reasonable demeanor she'd demonstrated during their coffee conversation. When discussing financial matters, she deferred appropriately to her attorney while occasionally offering clarifying information about specific assets or accounts. There were no emotional appeals, no attempts to reframe the separation narrative, no strategic vulnerability displays. The only notable tension emerged when discussing Rebecca's continued access to the house before its sale. She requested liberal entry rights to retrieve belongings as needed, while Eleanor suggested a more structured approach with scheduled visits and inventoried removals. My client has legitimate concerns about ensuring equitable distribution of jointly acquired property, Eleanor explained diplomatically, avoiding direct reference to trust issues stemming from the affair. My client has left with minimal personal items to respect Mr. Mercer's space during this difficult time, James countered. She shouldn't be unreasonably restricted from accessing her belongings in what remains legally her residence as well. After brief discussion, they reached a compromise. Rebecca would have scheduled access 3 times weekly during evening hours when Daniel would be present, with a final supervised division of remaining items once the house sale was confirmed but before closing. When the conference concluded, Rebecca approached Daniel directly while their attorneys gathered documents. That went smoothly, she observed, maintaining an appropriate professional distance. Thank you for being reasonable about everything. That's my goal, Daniel replied simply. A fair resolution without unnecessary conflict. Rebecca nodded, then hesitated briefly before continuing. There is one personal item I forgot to mention during the formal discussion. The blue coral piece we bought in Belize during our 2nd anniversary trip. I know it's not valuable financially, but it has sentimental meaning for me. The request surprised Daniel slightly. The decorative coral had been displayed in their living room for years, but Rebecca had never previously indicated particular attachment to it. In fact, she'd once suggested replacing it during a redecorating discussion, only to have Daniel advocate for keeping it because of its connection to their early marriage memories. Of course, he agreed, despite the puzzling nature of the request. You can take it during your next scheduled visit. Thank you. Rebecca offered a small, seemingly genuine smile. That means a lot. As they parted ways, Daniel mentioned the exchange to Eleanor, who raised an eyebrow thoughtfully. Interesting timing for a sentimental request, she observed. It establishes reasonableness and emotional connection outside the formal negotiation context. Classic soft approach ahead of potentially more significant requests. You think it's strategic rather than genuine? Daniel asked, unsure whether this represented appropriate professional caution or unnecessarily cynical interpretation. Not necessarily, Eleanor clarified. It could be entirely sincere. But in my experience, personal requests outside formal proceedings often serve dual purposes, securing the specific item while also establishing a pattern of accommodating emotional or sentimental appeals. The observation stayed with Daniel as he drove home, prompting reflection on how thoroughly his perception of Rebecca's motives had been altered by the affair's discovery and aftermath. Actions that once would have been accepted at face value now invited analysis of potential strategic underpinnings, a fundamental shift in how he processed her communication and behavior. 2 days later, Rebecca arrived for her first scheduled house access, dressed casually but carefully, her manner polite but distant as Daniel greeted her at the door. I'll focus on my office items tonight, she explained, moving toward the home office they had shared. Mostly professional references and personal files. Take whatever time you need, Daniel replied, retreating to the kitchen to provide appropriate space while remaining present as agreed. After approximately 40 minutes, Rebecca appeared in the kitchen doorway with a small box of items and a slightly hesitant expression. I noticed you've started packing books in the living room. Are you planning to move soon? I'm exploring options, Daniel acknowledged. The realtor thinks the house will sell quickly once listed, so I'm preparing accordingly. Rebecca nodded, her expression carefully neutral despite what must have been a stark visual confirmation of their marriage's end, their shared home being systematically dismantled, belongings separated into distinct futures that would no longer intersect. That makes sense, she said after a moment. I noticed the blue coral is still on the mantel. Is it okay if I take it tonight, or would you prefer I wait until the formal property division? You can take it now, Daniel confirmed. I set it aside with your name on it. Rebecca retrieved the decorative piece from the living room, returning with it cradled carefully in her hands. Thank you for remembering. I know it might seem like a small thing, but it reminds me of happier times. The comment, delivered with what appeared to be genuine sentiment, created a momentary bridge to their shared history, an acknowledgement of the positive experiences that had existed alongside whatever had ultimately led to betrayal. Daniel found himself responding to the authentic emotion beneath the carefully composed exterior. We had a good time in Belize, he acknowledged. That was a good trip. Rebecca's expression softened slightly. It was. We were happy then. The simple statement hung between them, not an attempt to rewrite history or manipulate the present situation, just recognition of a shared truth that remained valid despite everything that had followed. For a brief moment, they existed as two people with common memories rather than estranged spouses navigating formal separation. I should go, Rebecca said after the moment passed. Same time Thursday for the next scheduled visit? Daniel confirmed the arrangement, walking her to the door with the strange courtesy that had characterized their interactions since accepting the marriage's end. As she left, Rebecca turned back briefly. Daniel? Thank you for handling all of this with such dignity. It means a lot that we're not destroying each other through this process. The statement seemed genuinely appreciative rather than strategically placed, an acknowledgement of the measured approach they were both maintaining despite the painful circumstances. Daniel nodded in simple recognition, unwilling to either dismiss the sentiment or engage with it extensively. After Rebecca departed, he found himself studying the empty space on the mantel where the blue coral had been displayed. Its absence created a visible reminder of the incremental dismantling process they were engaged in, each visit removing another small piece of their shared history until eventually nothing would remain but memories and legal documentation. The following week brought another development, an email from Mark Stevens, Rebecca's affair partner, appearing in Daniel's personal account. Daniel. I know this email is unexpected and likely unwelcome. After considerable thought, I decided to reach out directly rather than allowing silence to be my final communication regarding a situation where I bear significant responsibility. What happened between Rebecca and me was wrong. There's no justification or explanation that changes that fundamental truth. While I won't presume to speak for Rebecca's feelings or motivations, I can address my own actions and acknowledge their impact on you and your marriage. This isn't an attempt to minimize harm or seek forgiveness. I simply believe you deserve direct acknowledgement from everyone involved rather than just Rebecca. The situation reflected profound failures of judgment and character on my part that you paid the price for despite having done nothing to deserve such treatment. I've left Meridian Architects for a position in another state, ensuring our professional paths won't intersect. This isn't mentioned as some noble sacrifice but simply as information you're entitled to regarding the aftermath of these events. No response is expected or necessary. I merely wanted to ensure you heard directly from me rather than learning through other channels or speculation. Mark Stevens. The unexpected communication prompted mixed reactions, appreciation for the direct acknowledgement without excuses, skepticism about potential coordination with Rebecca despite claims of independent action, uncertainty about appropriate response if any. After consideration, Daniel opted not to reply, recognizing that engagement would serve no constructive purpose while the acknowledgement itself provided a small measure of accountability previously absent from the situation. Later that same day, during a phone check-in with Eleanor regarding documentation for the upcoming court filing, Daniel mentioned the email without providing specific details. Interesting timing, she observed. Have you mentioned it to Rebecca during her scheduled house visits? No, Daniel replied. It didn't seem relevant to our current process. I agree, Eleanor confirmed, though if similar communications continue or escalate, we should document them appropriately. The conversation shifted to other matters, but Daniel found himself reflecting on Eleanor's interesting timing observation, the same phrase she'd used regarding Rebecca's choral request. The pattern recognition suggested either professional paranoia or legitimate identification of coordinated approaches that might not be apparent to someone without extensive experience navigating divorce proceedings. When Rebecca arrived for her next scheduled visit, Daniel noticed subtle differences in her presentation, slightly less polished appearance, more natural interaction, less carefully measured responses to routine questions about which areas she planned to focus on that evening. The shift might represent genuine emotional evolution or simply adaptation to established patterns that no longer required the same level of conscious management. As she gathered items from their shared office space, Rebecca called out a practical question about dividing digital photographs stored on their shared cloud account. Daniel joined her at the computer to discuss options, the technical problem providing neutral ground for collaboration without emotional complexity. I think creating separate archives makes the most sense, he suggested, demonstrating how they could each download complete copies before closing the joint account. That way we both have access to everything without ongoing connection. Rebecca nodded, watching the process with evident attention. That's perfect, actually. Clean and fair. She paused, then added with careful casualness, I got an interesting email yesterday. From Mark. The deliberate introduction of the topic suggested the email Daniel had received wasn't sent without Rebecca's knowledge, despite Mark's implication of independent action. Rather than immediately revealing his own identical experience, Daniel responded with neutral inquiry. What did he have to say? He's leaving Meridian for a position in Colorado, Rebecca replied, watching Daniel's reaction closely. He sent what amounted to a formal apology for his role in everything that happened. Very straightforward, no excuses. That seems appropriate, Daniel observed, maintaining neutral tone despite the confirmation that Mark's outreach represented coordinated action rather than independent accountability. He mentioned he was going to contact you as well, Rebecca continued, the statement phrased as information sharing rather than direct question while clearly inviting confirmation. He did, Daniel acknowledged simply, offering no additional detail or reaction that might guide Rebecca's response. She nodded, apparently accepting his minimal engagement with the topic. I thought you should know it wasn't at my suggestion. He made that decision independently. The claim contradicted the evidence of coordination suggested by their parallel conversations, but Daniel saw no benefit in challenging the narrative. Instead, he redirected to the practical task at hand, completing the digital archive separation while Rebecca gathered additional items from the office shelves. As their process continued over subsequent weeks, Daniel noticed a gradual shift in their interactions, moving from careful formality toward something resembling the comfortable familiarity of their early relationship. though without romantic overtones. Conversations became less rigidly structured, small moments of appropriate humor occasionally emerged, and the painful awareness of betrayal receded somewhat behind the practical focus on dismantling their shared life. The court date for finalizing their divorce arrived with remarkably little drama. The judge reviewed their settlement agreement, confirmed both parties entered it willingly with full understanding, and processed the legal dissolution with efficient compassion. Throughout the brief proceeding, Rebecca maintained composed dignity, offering appropriate responses to formal questions without emotional displays or attempts to create meaningful eye contact with Daniel. As they exited the courtroom, now legally separated individuals rather than a married couple, Rebecca paused in the hallway, her expression reflecting genuine emotion rather than strategic presentation for the first time in their post-discovery interactions. "So that's it," she said quietly. 8 years concluded in 20 minutes of legal formalities. "The legal aspect is complete," Daniel agreed. "The emotional processing takes considerably longer." Rebecca nodded, acknowledging the truth of this observation. "I know you don't want to hear this, and I promise it's the last time I'll say it, but I am truly sorry, Daniel. Not just for being caught or for the consequences, but for betraying someone who deserved better. Whatever narrative you've constructed about who I really am based on my worst decisions, please know there was genuine love there too, however badly I expressed it." The statement carried a ring of authenticity that had been absent from her earlier, more calculated apologies. Whether this represented genuine evolution in her perspective or simply better execution of emotional communication was impossible to determine with certainty, but Daniel found himself willing to accept the possibility of sincere remorse alongside strategic management. "I believe that's true," he acknowledged. "People are complex, capable of genuine affection and profound betrayal simultaneously. I don't think our marriage was entirely false, just fundamentally compromised in ways that couldn't be repaired." Rebecca accepted this assessment with a small nod. "The house closing is next week. After that, our practical entanglements will be completely resolved." "Yes," Daniel confirmed. "Clean separation, as we both wanted." They parted with formal handshakes rather than embraces, each heading toward vehicles that would carry them in literally different directions. Rebecca toward her new apartment downtown, Daniel back to the rental he'd secured while awaiting the house sale's completion. The following week brought the final chapter in their shared property, the house closing that would convert their last major joint asset into divided proceeds deposited in separate accounts. The process completed without their direct interaction, managed through representatives who handled paperwork and transfers with professional efficiency. That evening, as Daniel sat in his rental reviewing final documentation from the sale, his phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "Saw the closing confirmation. Another chapter officially ended. I hope you're doing well with everything, Daniel. Despite how things concluded, I'll always be grateful for the good years we shared." The message seemed designed as final personal communication, acknowledgement of formal conclusion without request for response or engagement. After consideration, Daniel replied with similar simplicity. "I appreciate that. I hope you find happiness moving forward." With that exchange, the personal aspect of their separation concluded alongside the legal and financial dimensions. The woman he had discovered wearing his shirt while smiling at another man, the catalyst for unraveling what he had believed was a solid marriage, would now exist primarily as memory rather than active presence in his life. 6 months later, having settled into a new condominium and established revised personal routines, Daniel received an unexpected email from Charlotte Ellis, the colleague who had provided crucial evidence about Rebecca's affair. "Daniel, I hope this message finds you well. I debated whether sending this was appropriate given our limited interaction, but ultimately decided you deserve the information as it relates directly to situations you were involuntarily involved in. Rebecca has been promoted to partner at Meridian. As part of the announcement, she's been giving interviews to industry publications about overcoming personal challenges and maintaining professional focus during difficult life transitions. While she hasn't explicitly referenced her divorce, the narrative strongly implies she navigated substantial personal obstacles created by others while demonstrating extraordinary professional dedication. The framing struck me as revisionist given what actually occurred, particularly since Mark Stevens' departure from the firm has been characterized as pursuing other opportunities rather than appropriate consequence for workplace misconduct. Perhaps this information isn't relevant to you at this point, and if so, please disregard it entirely. I simply believe in accountability and accurate representation of events, particularly when public narratives are being shaped that contradict documented reality. Regards, Charlotte Ellis. The information produced a complex reaction, not anger or renewed hurt, but a kind of resigned recognition that Rebecca's approach to narrative management had simply shifted to professional contexts now that personal dimensions had been resolved. The fundamental pattern remained consistent: strategic presentation designed to secure desired outcomes regardless of complete factual accuracy. After brief consideration, Daniel replied, "Charlotte, thank you for the information. While I've moved forward from the personal aspects of those events, I appreciate your commitment to accuracy and accountability. I'm not surprised by the narrative framing you've described. It aligns with patterns I observed throughout our separation process. At this point, I've accepted that Rebecca will present versions of events that serve her interests in various contexts. What matters is that those closest to me know the truth, and the legal aspects were resolved fairly for both parties. I hope your professional path is proceeding positively, Daniel." The exchange provided unexpected closure, confirmation that his assessment of Rebecca's character hadn't been exaggerated by emotional response to betrayal but represented accurate recognition of fundamental patterns that continued beyond their relationship's conclusion. 2 weeks later, while having dinner with Michael and his wife Emma, the conversation turned briefly to post-divorce developments. "Have you heard anything about Rebecca recently?" Emma asked, her tone carefully balanced between appropriate interest and respect for potential sensitivity. "She's been promoted at her firm," Daniel replied, sharing the public information without reference to Charlotte's more detailed insights. "Seems to be doing well professionally. Are you okay with that?" Michael asked directly. "Given everything that happened?" Daniel considered the question thoughtfully. "Yes, actually. Her professional success or failure has no bearing on my life now. I don't wish her ill, just continued separation." "That's very evolved of you," Emma observed with evident approval. "Not evolved so much as practical," Daniel clarified. "Continuing to track her life or care about her outcomes would mean remaining connected to a relationship that ended for good reasons. I prefer looking forward rather than back." The sentiment wasn't merely philosophical position but lived reality. In the months since their divorce had finalized, Daniel had systematically rebuilt his life according to authentic preferences rather than compromised arrangements, from living space to social connections to professional pursuits. The process had revealed aspects of himself that had been subtly suppressed or redirected during his marriage, creative and social dimensions that now found fuller expression. Later that evening, as he returned to his condominium, Daniel reflected on the complete arc from discovery to recovery. The image that had catalyzed everything, Rebecca wearing his shirt while smiling at another man, no longer carried the emotional devastation of initial betrayal. It had transformed into something more instructive than destructive, a moment of unintended truth that had ultimately freed him from a relationship built partly on managed perceptions rather than authentic connection. The woman who had worn his shirt while planning ongoing deception had revealed her true self in that unguarded moment more completely than in all her carefully crafted explanations and strategically timed emotional appeals afterward. That revelation, while initially painful, had provided the foundation for rebuilding a life based on clearer understanding of both others and himself, recognition that sometimes seeing someone's authentic self requires looking beyond the carefully managed presentation they've constructed for your consumption. He had walked into their bedroom and found her in his shirt, but it wasn't him she was smiling at, and that unintended moment of truth had ultimately shown him not just who she really was, but who he could become when freed from the constraints of strategic narratives masquerading as authentic connection. 1 year after finalizing his divorce, Daniel sat in a quiet restaurant waiting for his dinner companion. The establishment wasn't particularly remarkable: decent food, moderate prices, casual atmosphere, but it held significance as the location of his first date with Elise Chen, the architectural engineer he'd been seeing for the past 4 months. As he checked his watch, Daniel reflected on how differently he approached relationships now. Where his courtship with Rebecca had been characterized by immediate intensity and rapid commitment, his connection with Elise had developed gradually: casual coffee after meeting at a professional conference, occasional text conversations about shared interests, lunch meetings that slowly evolved into proper dates as mutual attraction became apparent. "Sorry I'm late," Elise said, sliding into the seat across from him. "Client meeting ran over, and then traffic was horrible." "No problem," Daniel replied, genuinely unbothered by the minor delay. "I ordered that Pinot Noir you liked last time." Elise smiled appreciatively, removing her jacket and settling in. At 38, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone comfortable in her professional expertise and personal identity. Her practical approach to life, addressing challenges directly rather than through strategic manipulation, had been one of the first qualities that attracted Daniel. Their conversation flowed easily through dinner, touching on work projects, weekend plans, and a documentary series they'd both been watching. There was none of the performance quality that had characterized so many interactions with Rebecca, no calculated vulnerabilities, no strategic self-presentation, just authentic exchange between two people genuinely interested in each other's perspectives. "So," Elise said as they shared dessert, "today marks something significant, doesn't it?" Daniel looked up, surprised by her awareness of the date. "You remembered." "Of course," she replied simply. "1 year since your divorce was finalized. You mentioned it a few weeks ago." Her acknowledgement of the anniversary carried no dramatic weight, neither exaggerated concern nor deliberate minimization, just straightforward recognition of a significant life marker. "It feels longer," Daniel admitted. "Not in a negative way, just in terms of personal distance from those events." "That makes sense," Elise nodded thoughtfully. "You've built a completely different life since then. New home, evolving career focus, different social patterns. And different relationship approaches," Daniel added with a small smile. "Definitely different relationship approaches," Elise agreed, returning his smile with one that reached her eyes completely. "Though I appreciate the careful pace. It's been healthy." The word choice struck Daniel as particularly apparent. Their developing relationship did feel fundamentally healthy, built on direct communication, mutual respect, and gradual trust building rather than intensity mistaken for intimacy or strategic management masquerading as connection. As they finished dinner and walked toward the parking lot, Elise took his hand naturally, her fingers interlacing with his without performance or calculation. "Any specific plans to mark the anniversary?" she asked. "Or is dinner with me celebration enough?" The teasing question carried no insecurity or manipulation, just comfortable confidence in their developing connection. "Actually, I have one small ritual planned," Daniel admitted. "Nothing dramatic, just something I've been considering as appropriate closure." "Intriguing," Elise replied. "Should I ask, or is it private?" "It's nothing secret," Daniel assured her. "I still have the video I took when I discovered Rebecca with Mark. I've never watched it since that day, never shared it with anyone. It served its purpose, preventing gaslighting about what I witnessed, but keeping it feels like maintaining an unnecessary connection to that moment." "So you're going to delete it?" Elise surmised. "Yes," Daniel confirmed. "It seems like the right symbolic gesture to mark moving forward completely." Elise squeezed his hand gently. "That sounds healthy too." They said goodnight with a lingering kiss, comfortable affection without performance or agenda. As Daniel drove home, he felt a profound appreciation for the authentic connection they were building, a relationship characterized by what was actually present rather than what was strategically presented. At home, Daniel poured a single glass of scotch and sat on his balcony overlooking the city. The condominium he'd purchased after the divorce reflected his personal aesthetic far more accurately than the house he'd shared with Rebecca: clean lines, functional spaces, and artistic elements that spoke to his specific sensibilities rather than compromised preferences. After a moment of reflection, he took out his phone and navigated to the secured folder where he'd stored the video from that fateful day. He hadn't viewed it since the immediate aftermath of discovery, having no desire to revisit the visual confirmation of betrayal once it had served its essential purpose of preventing narrative manipulation. His thumb hovered over the file briefly before he pressed play, watching with emotional distance that would have seemed impossible in the immediate aftermath. The 15 seconds of footage captured exactly what he remembered: Rebecca in his shirt, smiling at Mark with unguarded affection, sharing intimate conversation about future meetings, leaning in for a kiss that demonstrated both familiarity and enthusiasm. What struck him now, viewing with the perspective of time and healing, wasn't the betrayal itself but the authentic expression on Rebecca's face, an unguarded moment revealing genuine connection that contrasted sharply with the strategic performance she'd maintained throughout their marriage and its dissolution. Ironically, her most honest moment with Daniel had been one never intended for his observation. After the video ended, Daniel deleted it permanently, not in anger or lingering pain, but as deliberate closure to a chapter that had ultimately led to greater authenticity in his own life. The woman wearing his shirt while smiling at another man had unwittingly provided the catalyst for recognition and growth that might never have occurred otherwise. As he completed this small ritual, Daniel's phone buzzed with a text from Elise. "Home safe. Enjoyed dinner and conversation as always. Let me know if you want company this weekend, no pressure either way." The message exemplified what Daniel had come to value most in their developing relationship: direct communication without manipulation, respect for boundaries without pressure, authentic expression without strategic calculation. He replied with similar straightforwardness. Would definitely enjoy your company. Saturday lunch and that art installation you mentioned? And thanks for remembering today's significance without making it bigger than it needed to be. Elise's response came quickly. Saturday sounds perfect. And of course, significant dates deserve acknowledgement without unnecessary drama. Part of adult relationship skills 101. Smiling face with smiling eyes. The casual exchange reinforced Daniel's growing certainty that healthy connection was possible when both people prioritized authenticity over management, direct communication over strategic positioning, and genuine growth over narrative control. The contrast with his marriage to Rebecca couldn't have been starker, though he now recognized that relationships value as educational rather than merely painful. 2 weeks later, while attending a pharmaceutical industry conference in Boston, Daniel experienced an unexpected collision between past and present. During a networking reception following the day's sessions, he turned from a conversation with colleagues to find Rebecca standing nearby, apparently attending the same event with a client from her architectural firm. Their eyes met across the crowded room, mutual recognition immediate despite neither having seen the other in over a year. After a moment's hesitation, Rebecca nodded politely in acknowledgement before returning her attention to her companion. The brief interaction carried neither dramatic weight nor strategic undertone, just simple recognition between people with shared history now operating in separate spheres. Later that evening, as Daniel was leaving the reception, Rebecca approached him in the hotel lobby, her expression professionally composed but not performatively so. "Daniel," she said simply. "I thought that was you earlier. How have you been?" "I'm well," he replied with equal simplicity. "The conference has been interesting. You're here with a client?" "Yes, pharmaceutical facility expansion project we're bidding on," Rebecca confirmed. "I didn't know you'd be attending or I would have." She paused, apparently recognizing there was no natural completion to that sentence that wouldn't sound either presumptuous or insincere. "It's fine," Daniel assured her. "Professional paths occasionally intersect. It's not problematic." Rebecca nodded, seemingly relieved by his measured response. "You look good. Settled." "I am," Daniel acknowledged. "Life has evolved positively. And you? I heard about your partnership promotion. Congratulations." If she was surprised by his knowledge of her professional advancement, Rebecca didn't show it. "Thank you. Yes, that's been a positive development. The work is challenging but fulfilling." The conversation continued for another moment with similar surface-level exchanges, professional developments, brief mentions of mutual acquaintances, polite questions about family members. Throughout, both maintained the careful courtesy of people acknowledging shared history without attempting to create new connection. As they prepared to conclude this unexpected interaction, Rebecca hesitated briefly before speaking with what appeared to be genuine rather than strategic sincerity. "I know this is neither the time nor place for meaningful conversation about the past, and I don't expect or need response. But seeing you unexpectedly made me realize I never expressed proper accountability without strategic purpose behind it." She met his eyes directly. "What I did was wrong, not just the affair but how I handled everything afterward. You deserved better than both the betrayal and the calculated management that followed. I'm sorry for all of it," with no agenda attached to that apology. The statement struck Daniel as perhaps the most authentic communication he'd received from Rebecca throughout their entire relationship, straightforward accountability without apparent strategic positioning or narrative management. Whether this represented genuine evolution in her approach or simply refined execution of established patterns was impossible to determine with certainty, but he chose to accept it at face value. "I appreciate that," he replied simply. "I hope you find fulfillment moving forward, Rebecca." They parted without dramatic gestures or loaded farewells, just the quiet conclusion of an unexpected interaction between people whose lives had once been deeply intertwined but now proceeded independently. As Daniel walked toward the elevator, he realized the encounter had produced neither emotional disruption nor renewed pain, just the mild disorientation of worlds colliding briefly before continuing on separate trajectories. That night, Daniel called Elise from his hotel room, sharing the unexpected encounter during their usual evening conversation. "How did that feel?" she asked after he described the interaction. "Running into her unexpectedly after all this time?" "Surprisingly neutral," Daniel replied honestly. There was recognition of shared history without emotional charge. She offered what seemed like genuine accountability without obvious agenda, which was unexpected but not unwelcome. "People sometimes do grow," Elise observed, "or at least develop better self-awareness about their patterns." "True," Daniel acknowledged. though I'm content observing any such growth from a permanent distance. Elise laughed softly. Definitely the healthier approach. Did seeing her trigger any second thoughts or what-ifs? The question carried no insecurity or manipulation, just straightforward inquiry from someone secure enough in their connection to address potentially sensitive topics directly. None whatsoever, Daniel assured her truthfully. If anything, the interaction highlighted how thoroughly I've moved beyond that chapter. Seeing her felt like encountering someone from a previous job or old neighborhood, familiar but fundamentally disconnected from current reality. That's probably the best possible outcome, Elise noted. Complete healing doesn't mean forgetting or pretending significant relationships never existed. It means they no longer carry emotional charge that affects present choices. The observation reflected the thoughtful perspective that had drawn Daniel to Elise initially, her ability to acknowledge complexity without drama, to recognize emotional realities without strategic calculation. Their conversation continued, shifting to other topics, Elise's current project challenges, weekend plans for when Daniel returned, a recommendation for a book they'd both been interested in reading. Throughout, the exchange maintained the authentic quality that characterized their relationship: direct communication without manipulation, genuine interest without performance, emotional honesty without strategic vulnerability. As the conference concluded and Daniel prepared to return home, he reflected on the unexpected interaction with Rebecca and what it revealed about his own evolution. The woman he had discovered wearing his shirt while smiling at another man had once represented his most profound betrayal and disillusionment. Now, she existed primarily as the catalyst for growth and recalibration that had ultimately led to healthier patterns and more authentic connections. The final morning of the conference brought one last unexpected development. As Daniel checked out of the hotel, the front desk attendant handed him an envelope along with his receipt. "This was left for you this morning, Mr. Mercer," she explained. Inside was a brief note in Rebecca's distinctive handwriting. "Daniel, after our chance encounter, I realized there was one thing left unsaid that you deserve to hear without strategic timing or audience consideration. Thank you for handling our dissolution with dignity when you had every justification for scorched earth tactics. The recording you made but never distributed, the measured approach to our separation despite my initial narrative management attempts, the professional courtesy maintained throughout, all reflected character I failed to fully appreciate during our marriage. I've spent considerable time in therapy addressing the patterns that led to my choices and subsequent handling of their discovery. While that doesn't undo harm caused, I hope it suggests capacity for growth that might mitigate concern about similar behavior affecting others moving forward. I wish you continued happiness and fulfillment in whatever paths you're pursuing. Our marriage ended because of my choices, but the good years before those failures weren't entirely fiction, despite how discovery and aftermath might have reframed them. Rebecca." Daniel read the note twice before carefully folding it and placing it in his wallet. Unlike previous communications that had carried strategic undertones or narrative positioning, this message seemed motivated by genuine recognition rather than calculated management. Whether that represented meaningful personal evolution or simply refined approach was ultimately irrelevant to his own continued growth and forward movement. On the flight home, Daniel found himself reflecting not on Rebecca or their failed marriage but on the relationship he was currently building with Elise, the careful, intentional development of connection based on authentic communication rather than strategic management. The contrast highlighted how thoroughly his own approach to relationships had evolved since discovering Rebecca wearing his shirt while smiling at another man. That evening, as his plane landed and passengers began gathering belongings, Daniel's phone buzzed with a text from Elise. "Airport pickup still on schedule. Looking forward to seeing you. Brought dinner from that Thai place you like in case you're hungry after the flight." The simple, thoughtful message carried no performance or calculation, just genuine consideration from someone whose actions consistently aligned with expressed intentions. As he exited the terminal to find Elise waiting with a warm, authentic smile, Daniel felt profound appreciation for relationships built on what was actually present rather than what was strategically presented. "Welcome back," Elise said, embracing him naturally. "Conference productive?" "Unexpectedly so," Daniel replied, returning her embrace with equal authenticity. "In professional and personal development aspects." As they walked toward her car, Elise listened attentively while Daniel shared additional details about the conference sessions, the unexpected encounter with Rebecca, and the note she had left at his hotel. Throughout, Elise's responses reflected genuine interest without insecurity or strategic positioning, the hallmarks of healthy connection that had characterized their developing relationship from its beginning. It sounds like a positively clarifying experience, she observed as they drove toward his condominium. Confirmation that you've moved forward completely rather than just intellectually. Exactly, Daniel agreed, appreciating her perceptive assessment. Seeing Rebecca produced neither lingering pain nor residual attachment, just recognition of how thoroughly that chapter has concluded. Later that evening, as they shared the Thai food Elise had thoughtfully provided, their conversation shifted naturally to future possibilities, weekend plans, an upcoming concert series they both wanted to attend, a potential holiday trip they'd been discussing tentatively. I've been meaning to ask, Elise said as they finished dinner, how would you feel about meeting my parents when they visit next month? No pressure if it feels too soon, they'll be here for a week, so plenty of time to figure out scheduling. The invitation was presented without manipulation or strategic timing, just straightforward inquiry about a natural relationship progression step. Daniel considered it with equal straightforwardness, assessing his comfort level without either reflexive hesitation or premature commitment. I'd like that, he replied after a moment's consideration. It feels like an appropriate next step, not rushed or forced. Elise smiled, the expression reaching her eyes completely. I agree. They'll be here for Dad's medical conference, so pretty low-pressure circumstances, dinner one night, maybe the art museum another day if everyone's interested. The casual, practical approach to relationship milestone planning reflected their shared preference for authentic development over strategic management or artificial acceleration. Throughout their 4 months together, each step had proceeded naturally, neither rushed by intensity mistaken for intimacy nor manipulated through calculated vulnerability or strategic positioning. As the evening concluded and Elise prepared to return to her own apartment, their relationship progressing at a pace that respected both connection and independence, she paused at the door with a thoughtful expression. You know what struck me about Rebecca's note? She asked. She thanked you for not distributing the recording, but she never actually apologized for creating the situation that made such a recording necessary in the first place. The focus remained on your response to her actions rather than full accountability for those actions themselves. The observation demonstrated Elise's perceptiveness without suggesting jealousy or insecurity about the past relationship, just straightforward recognition of subtle narrative patterns that might escape less attentive analysis. I hadn't noticed that specific aspect, Daniel acknowledged, considering the insight. Though it aligns with established patterns, acknowledgement framed to emphasize the most sympathetic interpretation of her position. Not that it matters now, Elise added with a small smile. Just an observation about how some communication patterns persist even during genuine attempts at growth. They said goodnight with comfortable affection, a lingering kiss and simple embrace that carried neither performance nor calculation, just authentic connection between people building something based on what was actually present rather than strategically presented. As Daniel closed the door behind her, he reflected on the complete journey from discovery to recovery to new beginning. The woman he had found wearing his shirt while smiling at another man had unwittingly provided the catalyst for his most profound personal growth, recognition of relationship patterns he had accepted without question, development of boundaries he had previously neglected, appreciation for authentic connection he now prioritized above intensity or strategic management. In the strangest of ironies, Rebecca's betrayal, discovered through accidental early return rather than suspicious investigation, had ultimately freed him from a relationship built partly on managed perceptions rather than authentic connection. That unguarded moment when she smiled at another man while wearing his shirt had revealed more truth than all her carefully constructed explanations and strategically timed emotional appeals afterward. 2 years after walking into his bedroom to find that pivotal scene, Daniel had built a life more aligned with his authentic self than would have been possible had the betrayal never occurred or remained undiscovered. The pain had been real and significant, but the growth it catalyzed had ultimately led to greater authenticity in all aspects of life, professional pursuits, personal priorities, and relationship approaches. He had walked into their bedroom and found her in his shirt, but it wasn't him she was smiling at, and that unintended moment of truth had ultimately shown him not just who she really was, but who he could become when freed from the constraints of managed narratives masquerading as authentic connection.